Week 7. Last week, I set up Supabase's Postgres database for the app. The app now can correctly send write and read commands to the database. Ran into a couple of issues with navigation of all things. It wasn't database related, specifically navigation parameter passing. This is the very first page where I pass a parameter in the navigation route. And took me a while to debug the issue. It turns out that I used a wrong string template format for my user ID, causing the screen that's navigated to not receive the passed parameter. But that's fixed. So now the user can log in, and then the information is sent to the second screen when navigation library calls it. And the second screen can then use that information to retrieve the user data from Supabase's Postgres database backend. So that's working. And the goal for next week is not to work on any of the sort of the backend business logic stuff, but rather to flesh out the landing page for the user. In other words, it would be mostly compose work, Jetpack Compose. And if I have time, I'll try to hook it up to some sample data within the database, but I'm not going to set a high standard for me in terms of productivity. So I'll get the screen made next week, and the stretch goal is to hook it up to the database. What did I learn from last week? One of the things that I was actually quite pleased by is Supabase's backend setup. When I was thinking about making this app, I was a bit worried about actually having to make a backend to receive the requests from the app. Like typically you're supposed to send the request from the app directly to a backend server, and the backend server then validates the request and then makes database operations. You don't really want the user to directly access your database, because then many things can happen, right? The user can be malicious and stuff. So the backend server that receives the user request serves as the guard, if you will, the security guard before you can get into the vault of the database, which is your single source of truth. And if I had to do that would have been a lot of work. I'm not one of those 10x developers that can do everything in a week. Fortunately, Supabase's backend database service provides something that I didn't know before. It's called row-level security. In other words, the database can be configured such that the user request can be authenticated and validated at the database entry point. In other words, when a user is trying to make a change to the database can then receive the request and then decide, using the logic that you give it, whether or not the user is allowed to write to the database or make any other changes to the database. This drastically simplifies the architecture of the app that I'm currently making. There might be some exceptions where I still have to write some perhaps backend functions to receive the requests, but I haven't gotten there yet. And even if I needed to do that, it wouldn't be a full-fledged backend service. It would just be hopefully some edge functions or some Postgres remote procedural calls. And we'll get there when we see it. Sorry, we will cross the bridge when we come to it. That's about it for this week, and I'll see you next week.